Would I start Caleb Clarke for the All Blacks? No. And since I've said that, well, most people who have clicked on the video probably agree with me that Clarke is not the guy who should be starting at 11 or 14 for the All Blacks. The problem is, though, the amount of hate comments that Caleb Clarke seems to get in my comment sections is just absolutely ridiculous. The narrative in the eyes of most people in New Zealand rugby is that Clarke can't tackle, so should be replaced by Leicester Fainga'a-Anuku as winger or centre cover off the bench, with Shaun Stevenson at fullback. That narrative, however, applies two different sets of standards to the different candidates, with one torn down for simply doing his best, while the other candidates get away with making the same mistakes without any criticism from the masses. For every shocker like this one here on Darcy Graham, Caleb Clarke has produced several more, such as this stunner against South Africa. In this video, I'll be performing a player analysis video on Clarke, starting with his defense and comparing it to other players in an attempt to provide the most balanced possible view of the situation. My name's Max, I'm the host over here at the Black Jersey, and let's get into this. A common point of the discussion is Clarke's defensive positioning. I'm not going to defend that much at all. For much of 2022, it was terrible. The difference between Clarke and many other candidates for the winger positions, though, is that when he does get his positioning right, he can make the tackle. Despite Clarke's two solid hits to start the first test against South Africa, he copped it pretty bad for doing this here. This try, however, is not Clarke's fault whatsoever. George Bower, who I've pinged many a time for refusing to move far enough away from the ruck in the 8th minute, is the true source of this try. Angus Ta'avao on the other side isn't close enough because Ta'avao is in no man's land and not marking another player, and 96 kg David Havili has had to slow the front foot ball down from South Africa. Aaron Smith's role on defence is to move in behind the ruck, so without Havili on his feet, Bower has nobody to tell him to shift wide. If Bower shifts, we see Kane and Savia in new defensive positions. In this wide shot, we can now see that Kane and Bower are both marking Pollard, forcing Ioane and Clarke to defend the midfield instead, as they don't want to leave Jordie Barrett in a 2-on-1. Because Bower has forced Clarke to be marking Khaleesi, who's a flanker, he now isn't in a decent position to turn around and chase the kick. Arendse and Bodie both fail to fetch the ball, putting Jordan and Am in a 1-on-1 situation. Having marked Khaleesi in open play, Clarke knows he'll be the first ruck clearance available to Am, so immediately tracks around to clean the ruck. We'll get into this later, but Clarke's defensive role out wide also requires him to clean rucks. Because Jordie Barrett hasn't got around from fullback to help Jordan, though, Arendse is unmarked, so Clarke, who is unable to see Arendse from this angle, is now out of position. This try isn't the fault of Clarke at all, it's just a moment we need to give credit to the opposition for scoring a great try. Another try that Clarke was falsely blamed for in the 2022 Rugby Championship was this one to Juan Martin Gonzalez, Los Pumas' most promising player. The try is straight from the kickoff, with Gonzalez headed into a pre-planned position so that he can be the first ruck clearance for Emiliano Buffelli, while he's got Matthias Orlando as an outside option and Thomas Lavanini as a ruck clearance in support. While mid-air, Scott Barrett drops the ball backwards, forcing Shannon Frizzell to come from the backfield in attempts to tackle Gonzalez. Kane, however, is trying to land and gets in Frizzell's way, while Buffelli prevents George Bower from making the tackle too, though it's not an obstruction as Clarke is available to tackle Gonzalez. Clarke peels in, but trusts Bower too much. Aaron Smith, though, also misses the tackle. Clarke's defense is questionable for sure, but it definitely isn't downright dreadful. We can see a clear initial intention from Clarke to enter the ruck, as he's still learning his defensive role just 3 tests into performing it. The All Blacks also just deserved to lose this test anyway because of ill discipline. As for Andrew Kellaway's first try in Melbourne for 2022 in the 61st minute, people did try to pin this on Clarke, but it's just not fair to do so. There is just 4 seconds between Clarke being in the backfield here and Kellaway's line break that leads to the try. Well, I've gone over the All Blacks defense for this series of play in my previous upload about Jordie Barrett. To basically sum it up, Will Jordan has made a howler of an error shooting out of the wing to cover the 13 channel, which in turn forces Beauden Barrett to stand on the wing. Without an actual fullback in the backfield, Caleb Clarke then sees jersey number 15, Jordie Barrett, and anyone who sees that jersey number is almost certainly going going to assume they'll be shifting from this position and into the backfield. Barrett's sudden change of direction, as he's now playing in midfield for the rest of the match, now forces Clarke to commit to stopping Kellaway late, as he's now remembers that Geordie has indeed moved to centre. This isn't a unique mistake that Clarke could make either. Literally any random winger you can pluck out of a Super Rugby lineup would likely do the same, while Jordan has already made the error of shifting off the wing, not trusting this group over here of forwards to fill this gap. Clarke is also in a similar situation over here, before Kellaway's second try in the 67th minute. This is the most particular try that people try to pin on Clarke, but it just simply isn't realistic. The whole All Blacks backline has failed to read this Australian ploy to get on the outside. This tiny little shift from Koroy Betty towards the open side totally gives away exactly what the Wallabies are doing, while Foley travelling in this direction isn't a believable line at all. Foley is only 90 kgs, while he's marked by Dalton Papali'i, who is an absolutely massive flanker, as Ikitau is not in a realistic position to pass to Koroy Betty from over here either. This diamond shape from the Wallabies might as well just be a one-dimensional hands down the line play, as Foketi's only two options are to either go out the back or send Ikitau straight at Ioane without a single ruck clearance available from the pack who are all in a maul. What the All Blacks therefore need to do is spread out further so that Scott Barrett can move into where this gap over here is. If the All Blacks shift, they'll create a 2-on-3 and be able to gang up on both Kellaway and Petaia, who are out of frame. None of the All Blacks read the play though, as Papali'i ends up marking nobody. We see Mo'unga look to Koroy Betty before he sees Foley take the pass. Clarke has trusted Mo'unga to take out Foley, but now has to turn and attempts to take Kellaway out. If Mo'unga zones in on Foley in this freeze frame over here, it's a big hit, but Mo'unga stops committing to his rush defense line, putting Clarke in no man's land, and the try is scored. What we see here in Johannesburg though, I'm absolutely not in any universe ever defending this. This video is not a whole bunch of excuse making for Clarke's defense from 2022. This is just me giving it to you guys straight, and there's no excuse for Clarke shooting straight out of line towards LaRue, who has clearly got momentum towards his right, and that is another thing I am giving to you straight. Clarke needs to instead be standing slightly behind the 22-meter line so that LaRue's pass to Am can be cut off with both players clearly marked. From right here though, Clarke clearly hasn't defined who he is marking, with Mapimpi's presence in this channel allowing LaRue to continue carrying. LaRue's extra movements give Jordie Barrett no other choice but to rush up, and while Clarke manages to get to Lukhanyo Am, he no longer has the opportunity to get into the correct tackle position, so falls off. This is pretty woeful defense on Clarke's part, but what the haters won't talk about is that Will Jordan also defends badly, failing to recognise the fact that Clarke lacks the positioning to bring Am down. Jordan doesn't commit to being the second tackler and allows for Am to score, not recognising that Am isn't in a decent body position to make the pass. While Clarke cops all of the flack for poor defence, other poor defenders in New Zealand rugby just simply don't get held to the same standards, which is absolutely ridiculous in my opinion. Now that we've gone through the first part of the video and added a bit of context to a few of the defensive errors that Caleb Clarke made at test level last year, I want to compare his tackle stats to other candidates for the All Blacks starting winger roles. For example, I just want to show Caleb Clarke's tackle success rate from the Rugby Championship from 2022. So first off, he had a rate of 88%, which is 22 tackles out of 25 total attempts. Will Jordan, who has also made defensive mistakes but never been criticised for doing so, Jordan actually had a lower tackle percentage than Clarke, with 81% making 30 out of 37. And so Jordan, who never seems to get, I guess, insulted for his defence in the comment sections, actually had a lower tackle rate than Clarke last year. Clarke's defensive positioning when he returns to test level, I can get behind the statement that it was absolutely atrocious, but as I've shown you guys, there needs to be context applied to the situations. whereas obviously Clarke, when he does get the positioning right, as we can see through his tackle percentage, can finish the job. I'll also now look at some Super Rugby tackle percentages from a few of the other wingers, like I said I was going to do before. So Mark Talia and Amoni Narawa, defensively, I believe that they are the only out-and-out wingers in New Zealand who are up to test standards. Jordie Barrett, of course, is the guy who I think should be at fullback for those very same defensive reasons. Mark Talia, as we can see, 83% ratio for Super Rugby tackle ratio, and Amoni Narawa, incredible man, 88% with 52 from 59. That is outstanding for a winger, and that is why I basically just said, let's get him in a black jersey straight away. Whereas for Jordan and Clarke, we can see they were both at 77%. Jordan, I'm going to leave him alone because he didn't play a lot of game time during the season. He got 20 out of 26, whereas Clarke made 48 of 62 tackle attempts, so he's also at 77%. The biggest problem though is that the guys that a lot of the people in the comments want to replace Clarke with, Sean Stevenson and Leicester Fainga'a-Anuku, had lower tackle percentages than Clarke throughout the season. If you want to drop Clarke for being a bad defender, then why are you making comments about these guys replacing Clarke despite them having a worse tackle percentage? Stevenson made 76% of his tackles, whereas Fainga'a-Anuku is a turnover machine, absolutely, but in terms of making his out-and-out tackles, he did only get 66%. The Crusaders did use him as a replacement sweeper for David Havili as per their cover defense system, so the data is slightly distorted against Fainga'a-Anuku for that reason, though Fainga'a-Anuku's tackle percentage I still don't believe would have been as high as Clarke's. It's just such a ridiculous situation, I do believe, and as we can see with Clarke making 7 out of 9 tackles in this year's Rugby Championship, I don't think that the low tackle ratio is something we can read into at all. I don't want to be an optimist and be too positive. I don't want to be a pessimist and be too negative. I just want to be a reasonable person who gives Clarke the benefit of the doubt, and you can look over every single try that has been scored against the All Blacks since the Rugby Championship of 2022, and you'll notice that Clarke was not the primary reason, an error of his, wasn't the primary reason for the opposition scoring. We're now going to get into his attack and what he offers aside from Stevenson and Fainga'a-Anuku, because quite simply he offers far more in attack than Stevenson, who is a guy that is just running into a lot of manufactured holes over at the Chiefs. I can't show any video footage to back up this point because Sanzar will remove my channel, and I don't want that happening as this channel is my full-time job. But long story short, Clarke offers far more with ball in hand than Stevenson, and not only is he a far more dangerous carrier, but he's been used tactically for some very interesting stuff we're now going to have a look at. To showcase Clarke's usage in attack, we'll first go over an analysis I produced for the All Blacks test against Los Pumas from this year's Rugby Championship. As we can see, several All Blacks backs cleaned this ruck out wide with Caleb Clarke, Beauden Barrett and Jordie Barrett forming it around Sam Cane. As the All Blacks game plan resumes, we now see that the purpose of their ruck entry out wide is so that they can then form a particular attack structure. This attack structure, as I've explained previously, uses Clarke as a distributor. Because he hasn't got a long record as one, Los Pumas simply just don't see this coming, and so they don't spread out, and long story short, Jordie Barrett scores. Maybe I could be reading into a one-off situation too much, but the problem is, this happened twice in the same game. We'll go back to the opening try and we can see that although Clarke is stationed to defend against the first receiver from Los Pumas, he remains in this zone of the pitch to become his own side's first receiver after the Argentinian lineout is botched. As I've discussed in a previous video in very heavy detail, Lucio Cinti misreads how to defend this play completely, while Santiago Carreras from the alternative angle wisely weighs up what Damian McKenzie will do with the pass from Clarke. Cinti, now that we go back to the normal angle, completely rushes out of line, having panicked about Clarke being used as the key distributor of this play. He's so surprised to see McKenzie further back that he completely forgets about holding the line so that Rodrigo Bruni can remain stationed up against Barrett. In a normal rugby match with a counter-attack from inside the attacking side's own half, you'll normally expect the 10 to defend against their opponents, as per this diagram, but Clarke, who has no reason to be behind the line-out, has instead been put into this channel. As we can see from this change from one diagram to another, this places the All Blacks' key decision-maker Damian McKenzie out one more spot, to have more time to dissect holes in the opposition's defence. Because Clarke made just 57 passes compared to 102 carries in Super Rugby, he just simply doesn't have a reputation as a distributor. Plays like these are just something the opposition do not see coming. Clarke is not a one-dimensional crash and bash player anymore. His handling is coming along so well, so that's a second piece of added value from him in attack after his incredible pace and incredible power. While technique will always trump size when it comes to tackling, scrummaging, passing, cleaning rucks, carrying the lot of it, as Talia proved to us against the Wallabies, this is absolutely not the case when it comes to entering your own ruck when your own team has possession. I'll go into greater detail on this replay in my next match analysis video, which will be on both Bledisloe Cup tests from this year, but Clarke, who we can see in the 59th minute, is totally interchangeable with Scott Barrett in this pod, as they both have hard carry techniques and decent ball handling. The interchangeability between these two therefore means that either of these two rucks, either Barrett or Clarke, can enter, because Clarke enters after Aaron Smith's carry. Taukei'aho gets to take his time with entering the ruck before making a pick and go, because he doesn't have to worry about holding ball retention to his own responsibilities. Clarke's role as an extra ruck hitter out wide then subsequently gives him the chance to score off this own pick and go, thanks to Nepo Laulala giving him the push. The reason that I know this is Clarke's default responsibility against a structured defence is because of this genius move executed by David Havili against South Africa. But we'll skip how Havili gets the ball to just show Clarke's role as a ruck clearance option from wide. As this pod of Lomax, De Groot and Frizzell are in front of Havili, there are no ruck clearance options available to help the All Blacks retain possession if Caleb Clarke does what the audience wants him to do and just runs it straight. But if Clarke is here, well, who will be out wide to take the kick from Havili? Ladies and gents, that would be a key decision maker for the team, Ardie Savea. This kick is perfectly weighted with Savea in the exact right spot. This move we see in the 4th minute, it is clearly rehearsed. As Savea receives the ball, we then realise that Clarke, despite being a winger, is heavier than Savea. So regardless of which player is in which highlighted circle, this kick from Havili is still going to work. The reason that Clarke, who isn't a back, is here is so that Savea will get a proper clean out, not just a soft one that will let South Africa win the turnover. As Savea has been on the wing, Pollard has simply taken the bait and is now turning to chase, having not expected this at all. We now see Jesse Creel very heavily hesitate to go in on Savea, as he's aware that Savea can still pass to a back that's bigger than himself. By pairing Clarke with Savea in this 2-on-1, Savea is able to carry for about 40 metres before Clarke follows through the game plan and pins Damian Willemse into the ruck. Willemse can't roll away legally and is now yellow carded before the All Blacks are able to score 3 points off Mwonga's boot. This play with Savea and Clarke's interchangeability is the blueprint for a very similar formation we see in the 8th minute of the test, where Kane and Savea now clean a ruck around Clarke. So in all, Clarke is a highly talented player with ball in hand who has fixed his defensive positioning at test level. He's added his passing game as well to his overall game, and he's now a backline player who is interchangeable with a single man pod out wide. All of these factors behind Caleb Clarke as an All Black in the wide channels of the pitch are allowing Ian Foster and Joe Schmidt to field second playmakers such as Beauden Barrett, Damian McKenzie, Jordie Barrett and David Havili. And it's also for all of these very reasons that we are not going to see Sean Stevenson named to the All Blacks Rugby World Cup squad with less than a week to go. So, in conclusion, would I start Caleb Clarke for the All Blacks? No, I wouldn't, because Mark Talia at 11 and Will Jordan at 14 are my dream winger combo for a reason. They are both world class under the high ball, as distributors, as runners, as steppers, as full on tight carriers even, As defenders, Jordan is starting to improve over there as well. He didn't miss a single tackle throughout the Rugby Championship. Those guys are absolutely world class, but to keep Clarke on the bench is a way that you don't waste a lot of time that you've built creating other tactics. A lot of these ideas I showed you from 2022 on attack, and Clarke being the surprising distributor this year, we're going to see a lot of that just become a default if things aren't quite working, if a game is tight, if you can't really get expansive rugby going. Thank you very much for watching this video over here, guys. My name's Max, and I'm going to be signing out by asking you to support me over on Patreon like all these awesome people over here. I've got 3 tiers of different prices, and man, they are very much worth it. If you're at the top one, you get to have a video call with me every month, and the top 2, you also get a bit of a bonus video every month, and I also release early content for people every now and again that is available to all the tiers. I also just do a bit of behind the scenes stuff like share my scripts and everything. I'm also on Instagram and over on Threads. We are getting very close to the All Blacks World Cup squad announcement, and so I'm going to have a lot of content coming up in the next wee while. Thank you so much for clicking on the video, guys, and I'm going to see you later. Cheers from Max.